October 28th, 2026, 22:09 local time. The Strait of Hormuz, at the narrowest point of the transit corridor. 33 nautical miles wide at this position, with Iranian territorial waters beginning 12 nautical miles to the north and Omani territorial waters 12 nautical miles to the south. The center of the navigable channel is a 2 nautical mile wide shipping lane that every vessel transiting between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman must use. There is no alternative. There is no routing around it. The Strait of Hormuz is the only door, and tonight an Arleigh Burke Flight 3 guided missile destroyer is walking through it. The transit is not unannounced. U.S. Navy Strait of Hormuz transits are coordinated through maritime security communications channels and are known to Iranian intelligence approximately 6 to 18 hours before execution. The IRGC Navy has been tracking this specific ship since it departed Bahrain at 1730 through surveillance by shore-based radar, by 2 IRGC patrol boats that shadowed the ship at a distance of 4 nautical miles for the first 90 minutes of the transit, and by an overhead Shahed 149 surveillance drone that had been orbiting at 5,200 meters altitude since 1945. The destroyer's commanding officer knows he is being watched. He has transited the strait 11 times in his career. Being watched is normal. The surveillance is aggressive, but within the parameters of what Iranian forces do in international waters and airspace. His ship is at MCON Alpha, a mission control level alpha, which restricts electronic emissions to those essential for safe navigation. The SPY-6 radar is in passive receive mode only, not transmitting. The goal is to reduce the ship's electromagnetic signature, present a lower profile transit, and avoid the appearance of aggressive posturing in a constrained waterway where miscalculation is expensive. MCON Alpha is standard protocol for Hormuz transits. It is also, as the next 94 minutes will demonstrate, a posture that creates a specific and documented vulnerability. Welcome. I'm your host at Navy Legends, and tonight we are going somewhere that most military analysis avoids. Not into the kinetic engagement, not into the missile intercept sequence, but into the digital infrastructure underneath all of it. Because the most dangerous attack that can be made on a modern warship is not the one that puts a hole in its hull. It is the one that makes the crew believe the hull is fine, while the world around them has become a lie. Tonight, we are examining a fictional but technically grounded scenario in which an Iranian cyber operation targets the Aegis combat system of a U.S. Navy destroyer at the moment of maximum vulnerability. In the Strait of Hormuz, constrained by geography, operating at reduced emissions, without immediate support, this is a fictional simulation. Every system described here is real. Every vulnerability exploited has a documented basis in publicly acknowledged research on naval combat system cybersecurity. Let's begin. The Iranian operation had a name inside the IRGC Cyber Command, Cheshme-e-Kur, Blind Spring. It had been in development for 22 months. The attack vector was not a direct network penetration of the destroyer's combat system. The Aegis Baseline 10 system runs on a classified network that is air-gapped from external internet connections. It cannot be reached from outside the ship through a conventional network intrusion path. The IRGC Cyber Command knew this. They had spent 4 months attempting conventional network approaches before their technical leadership concluded that the direct path was closed and that an indirect approach was required. The indirect approach they developed had 3 stages. The first stage was a supply chain compromise executed 14 months before the attack. A subcontractor providing calibration software updates for the AN/SPY-6 volume search radar's signal processing module. A small defense industry firm with 340 employees and a classified contract for periodic software maintenance had been penetrated by an Iranian intelligence operation that had taken 11 months to execute. A single software engineer at the firm, targeted through a sophisticated social engineering campaign that began with a fake job offer from a European defense consultancy, had been recruited as an unwitting conduit. The malicious code he had introduced into the calibration update package was not immediately active. It was a logic bomb, a dormant payload that would activate only when a specific trigger condition was met. The trigger condition was a combination of 3 simultaneous parameters. geographic position within the Strait of Hormuz transit corridor. MCON Alpha emission. Status as indicated by the ship's own internal system logs, and a specific encrypted command signal transmitted on a frequency band used by the Shahed 149 surveillance drone. All three conditions would need to be present simultaneously for the payload to activate. The second stage of the operation was the positioning of the Shahed 149 drone overhead the strait, which had been accomplished routinely, as described, without arousing specific concern. The third stage was the cyber payload itself. When activated, the logic bomb would not crash the Aegis system. A crash would be immediately detected and the system would be rebooted, restoring functionality within minutes. Instead, the payload was designed to do something far more subtle and far more dangerous. It would corrupt the SPY-6 radar's target discrimination algorithm in a specific and precisely calibrated way. Not enough to produce obviously wrong outputs that a trained operator would immediately question, but enough to introduce systematic errors into the radar's identification of specific radar cross-section profiles. Specifically, the corrupted algorithm would classify small, fast, low-altitude contacts, the radar cross-section profile of a sea-skimming cruise missile, as surface vessel contacts, and would display them on the combat system's tactical picture as surface vessels rather than airborne threats. A cruise missile, traveling at Mach 0.8 at 5 meters altitude, approaching the ship from bearing 340 degrees at a range of 40 nautical miles, would appear on the destroyer's Aegis display as a surface contact. A small vessel, apparently stationary or slow-moving, at approximately the same bearing and range. It would look like an Iranian fishing boat. It would look like one of the 100 fishing boats that clutter the Strait of Hormuz on any given night. The crew would see it. They would track it. They would not engage it. And by the time the contact's closure rate revealed the deception, by the time the operator watching the surface plot noticed that the fishing boat was closing at 900 kilometers per hour, the weapon would be too close. At 22:09, the Shahed 149 transmitted its activation signal on the designated frequency. The logic bomb activated. The corrupted calibration parameters propagated through the SPY-6 signal processing chain in 0.4 seconds. The Aegis display did not flicker. There was no error message. There was no indication that anything had changed. The tactical picture on the Combat Information Center's main display looked exactly as it had looked before, 22:09, except that it was now partially wrong in ways that no one in the CIC yet knew. At 22:11:34, a battery of 4 Iranian Noor anti-ship cruise missiles, launched from a mobile battery concealed in the Zagros mountain foothills, 74 kilometers northeast of Bandar Abbas. The Noor, the Iranian reverse-engineered C-802, is a subsonic sea-skimming cruise missile with a 165-kilogram semi-armor-piercing warhead, a cruise speed of Mach 0.8, and a terminal phase sea-skimming altitude of between 3 and 7 meters. Its radar cross-section in the sea-skimming profile is approximately 0.015 square meters, precisely the target profile the corrupted algorithm had been tuned to misclassify. The 4 Noor missiles dropped to sea-skimming altitude within 45 seconds of launch and began their approach to the strait on a bearing that would bring them to the destroyer's position in approximately 18 minutes. The SPY-6 painted the 4 contacts at 22:14:02, the moment the missiles cleared the radar horizon at a range of 31 nautical miles. The signal processing system evaluated their radar cross-section profiles, their altitude returns, and their velocity data. The corrupted algorithm processed the altitude data correctly. It saw the contacts at 5 meters, but the classification module, operating on the corrupted target discrimination parameters, cross-referenced the altitude, cross-section, and velocity data against its target database and returned a classification of surface vessel, small craft, closing, bearing 024, 4 surface contacts, bearing 024, range 31 nautical miles. On the CIC's surface plot, 4 new symbols appeared, the blue diamond icons that represent tracked surface vessels. They were moving, clearly. The track vector showed their closure rate. but their closing speed was displayed as a function of their surface vessel classification, which forced the tracking algorithm to assume a maximum surface speed of approximately 50 knots. At 50 knots, 4 small craft at 31 nautical miles represented a contact time of approximately 37 minutes. Concerning, worth watching, consistent with aggressive IRGC small boat positioning. Not an immediate threat. The track coordinator logged the contacts and reported them to the tactical action officer at 22:14:19. Tau, track. 4 new surface contacts bearing 024, range 31 miles, closing. Assess possible IRGC small craft. Closure rate consistent with high-speed surface vessels. The tactical action officer acknowledged and directed the electronic warfare operator to attempt signal collection on the contacts, to try to detect radar emissions from what the system was calling small craft. No radar emissions were detected. Sea-skimming cruise missiles do not typically emit radar during their cruise phase. The absence of radar emissions was consistent with either stealth small boats or an option the operator considered for approximately 1.5 seconds before dismissing it. Non-emitting air contacts classified incorrectly. He dismissed it because the system was telling him they were surface contacts. He had been trained to trust the system. At 22:17:44, the watch supervisor noticed something anomalous. The 4 surface contacts had closed to 22 nautical miles in 3 minutes and 42 seconds. A closure rate of approximately 355 knots over the ground. No surface vessel achieves 355 knots. She called it immediately. Tau, these contacts are closing at 355 knots. That's not right for surface. Request reclassification. The tactical action officer looked at the track data. 22 nautical miles. Closure rate 355 knots. He did the math in 2 seconds and felt the bottom drop out of his situational awareness. These are missiles. Combat. Reclassify all 4 contacts as airborne, hostile. Set condition, zebra. Weapons free. He keyed his radio simultaneously. Bridge, combat. Inbound missiles bearing 024, range 22 miles. All ahead flank. Hard right rudder. The time between first detection at 22:14:02 and correct reclassification at 22:17:51 was 3 minutes and 49 seconds. In those 3 minutes and 49 seconds, the missiles had closed from 31 nautical miles to 22 nautical miles. They had 22 nautical miles remaining. At Mach 0.8, that was 2 minutes and 40 seconds to impact. The SM-2 Block 3B engagement sequence requires approximately 45 seconds from weapons-free authorization to first missile away for a trained crew conducting a drill. Under combat conditions, with a crew that had just experienced the disorientation of a threat reclassification from surface to air. The first SM-2 left the VLS at 22:18:27. 36 seconds after weapons free. Time remaining to impact of the first Noor missile. 2 minutes and 4 seconds. The tactical action officer fired 2 SM-2s per target. 8 total, consuming a significant fraction of the ship's forward VLS inventory in a single salvo. The first SM-2S left cells 4 and 6. Cells 8, 10, 14, 16, 20, and 22 followed at 1.8-second intervals. The engagement geometry was extremely tight. At 22 nautical miles when the firing sequence began, the SM-2 engagement against a sea-skimming target at 5 meters altitude required the missile to fly a depressed trajectory, fighting gravity while tracking a target that was itself fighting gravity at the bottom of its altitude envelope. The SM-2's seeker acquisition in this geometry was reliable to approximately 15 nautical miles. The forward fire control radar, the SPG-62, had been slewing to bear on the threats from the moment the reclassification was called. The first SM-2 acquired its assigned target at 22:18:49 and guided to intercept. Detonation at 12.4 nautical miles. First Noor missile destroyed. The second SM-2 on the same target, the backup round, was redirected by the Aegis engagement manager to the third inbound contact, which had been the lowest priority assigned target. It acquired and detonated at 10.1 nautical miles. Third Noor missile destroyed. The third and fourth SM-2 rounds engaged the second Noor contact. First round missed. The SPG-62 fire control radar had briefly lost track of the second contact during the engagement of the first, and the seeker reacquired 0.8 seconds late, producing a miss distance of 340 meters. Second round acquired and detonated at 8.7 nautical miles. Second Noor missile destroyed. 3 down, 1 remaining. The fourth Noor missile, bearing down from bearing 024 at Mach 0.8, had now closed to 6.2 nautical miles. At that range, the time to impact was 46 seconds. The 2 SM-2 rounds assigned to the fourth contact had both been redirected during the engagement sequencing to cover the near miss on contact 2. No SM-2 remained assigned to contact 4. The tactical action officer called RAM, rolling airframe missile, on the fourth contact at 22/1931. The ship's RIM-116 launcher, positioned on the port bridge wing sponson, had the target in its passive infrared seeker field from the moment the missiles had been reclassified as airborne. It had been tracking on passive IR through the entire SM-2 engagement. It fired 2 rounds in immediate succession at 22/1934. The first RAM round guided on the Noor missile's infrared signature and detonated at a range of 2.8 nautical miles from the ship, 3.1 seconds before the Noor would have reached the ship's hull. The proximity fragmentation pattern shredded the Noor's intake and control surfaces. The missile pitched nose down and impacted the ocean 1.9 nautical miles off the destroyer's port bow. The second RAM round was already past its optimal engagement envelope when the first detonated. It flew through the debris field of the destroyed Noor and self-destructed at 22/1943. All 4 Noor missiles were neutralized. The ship had not been hit, but the crew was shaken in a way that a clean, anticipated engagement does not shake a crew. They had watched 4 missiles approach for 3 minutes and 49 seconds, while the system told them the missiles were fishing boats. They had lost 3 minutes and 49 seconds of engagement time. Time that, against a faster weapon, or a larger salvo, or a weapon with a longer range terminal phase, would have been fatal. They had fired under extreme time pressure with a degraded engagement geometry, and had survived by a margin that the after-action mathematics would place at approximately 40 seconds of additional decision time before the outcome would have been different. The commanding officer reported the engagement to 7th Fleet at 22/21:07. His report included a specific and urgent request: a complete diagnostic of the ship's Aegis combat system software, comparing current installed parameters against the certified baseline configuration. The diagnostic began at 22:23:44. The corrupted calibration parameters in the SPY-6 target discrimination module were identified at 22:47:11. 24 minutes into the diagnostic, the module's classification algorithm for the specific radar cross-section bracket between 0.01 and 0.05 square meters had been modified in a way that redirected contacts in that bracket, and only contacts in that bracket, from the airborne track algorithm to the surface track algorithm. The modification was 31 lines of code in a 280,000-line software package. The modification had been signed with a valid cryptographic certificate from the subcontractor's authorized software update credentials. The Naval Criminal Investigative Service was notified at 22:51. The Defense Intelligence Agency was notified at 22:54. The NSA's Cybersecurity Directorate was notified at 23:02. The affected software package, version 4.7.3 of the SPY-6 signal processing calibration module, was immediately flagged as compromised across the entire fleet. Every ship carrying the affected version was ordered to conduct the same diagnostic. By 6 a.m. the following morning, the corrupted module had been identified on 7 additional ships that had received the same calibration update. 7 Aegis-equipped warships had been operating with partially blinded combat systems. For how long depended on when each ship had received the update. The earliest installation had been 14 months prior. The subcontractor was placed under immediate federal investigation. The software engineer whose credentials had been used to sign the malicious update was interviewed by NCIS and FBI within 18 hours. He had no knowledge that his credentials had been compromised. The social engineering operation that had obtained them had been so carefully constructed that he had never been aware it occurred. His professional conduct was cleared. His career was nonetheless effectively ended by the security review that followed. The full scope of the Iranian supply chain penetration, which systems had been affected, what data had been exfiltrated during the 14-month dwell time, what other dormant payloads might exist in other software packages from other subcontractors, required a classified assessment that took 9 months to complete. The unclassified summary of that assessment, released in July 2027, contained one sentence that the defense press repeated extensively. The scope of the compromise exceeded initial estimates. This is the scenario that Navy Legends has been building toward in every episode about missiles and radar and electronic warfare and drone swarms. Because all of those kinetic threats, as sophisticated as they are, as expensive and lethal as they are, operate in the physical world. They can be detected. They can be tracked. They can be shot down. The defensive systems that defeat them are real, tested, and continuously improved. The threat we examine tonight operates below that layer. It operates in the digital substrate on which all of those physical systems depend. It does not attack the missile. It does not attack the radar. It attacks the algorithm that tells the radar what it is seeing. It turns the most sophisticated air defense system in the world into a system that cannot tell a missile from a fishing boat for 3 minutes and 49 seconds, which against the right weapon is exactly long enough. The Noor missile was a relatively slow, subsonic, 1980s-derived design. The engagement, even with the 3-minute 49-second delay, was recoverable because the SM-2's engagement envelope at 22 nautical miles provided sufficient time once the crew had the correct picture. Against a supersonic weapon, a Mach 3 air-launched anti-ship missile, a Chinese YJ-12, a Russian KH-31, the same 3-minute 49-second delay would not be recoverable. At Mach 3, a missile at 31 nautical miles reaches its target in 6 minutes and 20 seconds. Subtract 3 minutes and 49 seconds of classification delay. The crew has 2 minutes and 31 seconds for detection, reclassification, engagement authorization, and SM-2 time of flight. Against a Mach 3 target at 22 nautical miles, the range at which reclassification occurred tonight, the time to impact is 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Subtract engagement overhead. The math does not work. The IRGC used the Noor because a survivable demonstration, one that confirms the attack vector worked, inflicts no kinetic damage, and produces a maximum intelligence and psychological effect, is more valuable than a strike that sinks a destroyer and triggers a US military response that Iran is not prepared to absorb. The goal of Cheshme-Yakur was not to destroy the ship. It was to demonstrate that the ship could be blinded, to put that knowledge in every classified after-action report, every fleet intelligence summary, every threat assessment prepared for the next generation of US naval commanders. The message was received. The question that the message poses is one that no radar upgrade and no missile intercept can answer alone. How do you trust a combat system whose software supply chain runs through hundreds of subcontractors, dozens of update cycles, and thousands of lines of code that no single human being has read in their entirety? There is no complete answer. There are partial answers. Better software verification, cryptographic integrity checking, behavioral anomaly detection, red team penetration testing of installed systems. All of these exist. None of them are sufficient alone. All of them are necessary. The destroyer cleared the Strait of Hormuz at 2344. It anchored in Omani waters outside Muscat for a full software diagnostic and system recertification that took 4 days. It never received an explanation of how the logic bomb had survived 14 months of routine maintenance cycles without detection. The answer to that question is still classified. Stay informed. Stay vigilant. I'll see you in the next one.